Welcome back to On the Clock, our show about making the moments matter. I'm your host, Elisa Gums. Today, we're chatting about keeping up the fight for racial equity with Natalie Norfus, the managing owner of the Norfus Firm PLLC, which partners with employers globally on human resources and diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. Natalie, we're so excited to have you here on the Clock. How are you today?
Amazing. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
You have 2 decades of experience in this space, from an employment lawyer all the way up to a chief diversity officer. How did you come to devote your professional life to diversity and inclusion?
That's such a great question. I love being asked this question. I always credit it to like the layers of my own identity and understanding that I come from very different backgrounds on both sides. My mom's family came to the US during the Holocaust from Germany, Jewish. And my dad's family started with their roots in Georgia. My grandparents were sharecroppers who moved north, like a lot of Black Americans, so my grandfather could work in a steel mill. And my mother did a really great job of really exposing me to both sides of myself. And so from the beginning, I've really been interested in the layers that are someone's identity. I think as I've matured, I recognize like we're not one thing or two things. I don't think I recognized that at that time, but I just thought it was very cool that I had all these different stories that made up who I was as a person. So it definitely started there. And then when I went to high school in DC and was lucky enough to go to a high school on George Washington University's campus. And so when I was 16, I started taking classes, college classes, and I was super focused on like international politics, Islamic humanities. Like I was always in this mix of learning different perspectives, different cultures, different government structures. It was like fascinating to me and still is today. So I credit that beginning. And I went to law school at GW. And in law school, I was in the immigration clinic. And I was really dead set on getting someone back in the US that I knew that had been deported, which was a very naive reason to choose a law school, but it was one of the best experiences ever. And when it was time for me to practice law, the firm I went to didn't allow for me to do immigration. So labor and employment was the next closest people area. And I really love solving people problems. I always say we do that here. And so that set me on this journey, like in a more formal setting in terms of really understanding the trends around DEI. When I started even just an intern at law firms, it was just diversity. It wasn't diversity, equity, and inclusion yet. So I always say I started when it was an infant, and I think now we're in a young adult phase with DEI. But yeah, that's just sort of some of the beginnings for me.
You spoke a little bit about how your own background has influenced your passion for DEI, your different racial, I know, religious, cultural backgrounds that you come from. Did you
Mhm.
find it difficult to navigate those identities professionally or to navigate people's assumptions about those identities in the workplace?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting because I had recently, probably within the last 2 years, made a post about this because I never actually felt accepted on, my mom's side of the family. I never felt even really part of the Jewish community. While my mother did a really great job of, making sure that I celebrated high holidays and understood the traditions, like I always felt like an outsider. And it was starkly different on my dad's side of the family. So my dad has a huge family. Everyone was welcome. You felt it always. My grandmother, I learned later that my grandmother was like a total G. Like she always made sure we were all together. And so I have really, really close relationships with, my cousins. I'm an only child, so they've been like siblings to me growing up. And so it was such a difficult world to navigate in some respects because, I'd say to someone like, oh, I'm Jewish. And you could see their face being very confused, right? Crunching up and like doing those mental calculations of seeing someone who appears to them to be Black and how could you be Jewish? And I even had a CEO I work with like come back to it. So wait, how are you Jewish again? And you're like, why does it matter? Right. And so, but at the end of the day, it's like I've never felt part of that community. And so In my work environment, I've always had the experience of a Black woman. I mean, I've had people come to me and say, like, hey, as a Black woman, which is really not a cool way to start a conversation at work, but, I've had those conversations. And I tell people all the time, like, I've never been confused for like a white person or a white Jewish person. And so I don't actually really know what that feels like, I suppose, or I know what it feels like from my perspective, but it has been an interesting battle, I think, throughout my career.
Are there any sort of specific incidents or workplace realities that stand out to you that made you really want to ensure a different experience for other people?
So my father worked in pharmaceutical sales for over 20 years. And when I was in my second summer interning, I went home. I'm from Cleveland originally, so I was with my dad, and he, we went to some party with like some of his pharmaceutical colleagues, and I looked around and I'm like, he was the only Black person there. And when we were leaving, I said to him, I was like, do you ever get tired of being like the only Black person? And he's like, every day. And something about that conversation like really just cemented for me like the importance of continuously finding ways to speak up for people. I mean, I've always been that way. I kind of have a big mouth. I think people know that about me. But so I'm always going to say what I think. But it was that conversation where I'm like, I'm going to be entering the work world soon, and have very many times been one of only or one of a few. And if you're one of a few, they always confuse you with each other, which happened regularly throughout my early years in as a lawyer. And so it's that thing of like, when they talk about microaggressions being those like little tiny mosquito bites that like they like the one is not bad, but when they keep layering and laying on top, it creates a lot of frustration and discouragement. So for me, it's like when I saw my dad and how hard he worked and just how exhausting that had to be for him, it was like, okay, we gotta do something here and use my voice, as I can to for others.
4 years ago, you decided to leave corporate America and go out on your own. Tell us
Yep.
about your decision to approach DEI in this way now as an entrepreneur, and about the work that the Norfus firm does.
Yeah. So, like a lot of women, like a lot of people of color, I felt that proverbial glass ceiling. And I was looking around and I was like, I can do way more than this. Like, I felt like I had not reached anywhere near my potential in terms of the impact I could have and the type of work I do. And so it was like one of those moments where, okay, you could have just kept trying and kept pushing, but I didn't think that my voice or my ability to impact was going to happen where I was. And so initially, actually, when I started the Norfus firm, it was just me. And I was doing internal investigations, which I still do this day because I really like to understand some of the issues that relate to workplace conflict. And frankly, I just needed a break from the DEI work because I gave my soul to it. Right, I was so invested. It was the way I explained it to people was that there's things about your job you don't like, but you can live with. Right, so if it's like, okay, you used to have maybe an assistant who helped you process invoices and they decide they're going to take that role away and now you have to process the invoices. Like, I may not like that, but that doesn't harm me. It's cool. Like, fine, I add it to the list. But there were just certain things that always feel about DEI that are very embedded in who I am. And I just couldn't separate, the personal feelings about it from it being part of my job. So I was doing investigations, and then the team grew. We started really focusing on how to incorporate mindfulness. And when I say mindfulness, I'm saying that from the standpoint of thinking about who you're dealing with, who you're dealing with, what they're coming from, and how we start to interact with each other. And of course, after George Floyd was murdered, our DEI work exploded. Now we were doing it before that, but it exploded, and it was such an eye opener of where different companies are in their DEI journey. And so for us, we are super data driven. We love data. And the reason why is DEI is a business decision. And when companies decide to add new products or services, they rely on data. When they look at how products are performing in the market. They look at data. They do they do tests with test audiences and seeing how things go. I mean, my son was actually in The Hate You Give, and they tested his character with an audience before they decided to put it out, or just to get an idea of how it's going to perform. So DEI is no different. And I think that we are very vigilant about coming in and understanding where an organization is in its journey, from doing surveys, leadership interviews, looking at all their policies and how they're supposed to work, and understanding from surveys and listening sessions how they're actually working. Because there is no real way to make a good business decision without understanding where you are. And I think that's where DEI has struggled, because people feel like they can sort of check boxes and do these programs or do things that are just very surface level, that don't even necessarily respond to the issue that they may be having. And so for us, we really walk this journey with our clients, from really like, where are you? And getting really deep and really uncomfortable, and warning people it's going to be uncomfortable, because it's really the only way you can grow is with that discomfort.
You host a podcast called What's the Deal? DEIL, with the L standing for leadership. It's aimed at organizational leaders, and it explores practical strategies and best practices for creating employee connection, engagement, and retention. You make the very good point that DEI efforts at organizations are often made or broken by individual leaders. So, what do leaders most commonly get wrong about DEI?
Not being present, um, thinking that it's somebody else's job to do. So um, it's fascinating how often CEOs sort of take a back seat and think that either their HR teams or a chief diversity officer or other folks who are doing DEI work are going to be able to fix it. It's not one person's job, it's everybody's job in a company. And with leaders in this day and age, being really clear about your why around DEI, why does it matter to you personally, and then why does it matter to your company, is so important. Because what workforces are demanding is that we go beyond the surface. And if a leader is just getting talking points, from a communications person or a DEI person, and they don't actually have their own investment, it's obvious, right? People can tell. They're demanding transparency and authenticity, and all of those things start with your own self exploration. So again, I think the lack of really being present in what the issue is one of the biggest issues that we see.
On the other hand, one of the things that you advocate for, and one of the things that can take the outcome of these efforts out of the hands of individual people, is what you call operationalizing
Mm,
DEI. What do you
yes.
mean by that?
Oh, I love operationalizing. If you can't tell, I'm really nerdy about this stuff. But um, so operationalizing is integrating DEI into the fabric of what you do. So we talk about this a lot in terms of, like, if someone calls and says they need a DEI recruiting strategy, my answer is you need a recruiting strategy, because it's not, we are doing DEI on the side. And when you do DEI on the side, that means you're really only focusing on, okay, which 3 or 4 HBCUs should we be going to? Which 3 or 4 HSIs should we be going to? And like that covers it. When the deeper issue is, what are there pieces of the way you recruit? Are there pieces of the things that you look for in candidates? Are there pieces of the way in which you evaluate candidates that create barriers for certain groups of people? That's the first place, is like, are there barriers in your process to accessibility to the jobs? And then when you're clear about, okay, we've looked through these processes and we're making sure that we conduct them in a way that is free from bias, which we do executive recruiting as well. And we have a very disciplined process to help eliminate bias. And we're constantly looking for ways to make sure that we're eliminating bias. That's one part of it. And then the other part of it is, how are you going out and finding people? Where are you going to look? Are you being critical of yourself? Does the role really need someone to have a bachelor's degree? And if so, why? Because we know from data that a lot of people of color and marginalized folks are excluded from jobs they may otherwise be qualified for because they don't have degrees? Are you challenging yourself in that way? Are you going to the same 10 schools that all of the big companies are going to, so you all are fighting for the same people? It's looking at how you really want to go about finding people, again using this recruiting example, from a holistic standpoint, and not DEI separate from it. It's part of it. And you have the right voices in the room, the right expertise to help guide you in that process of, again, looking to see that you're avoiding bias and looking in the right places and challenging the needs of the job, that type of thing. So when we are talking to clients, we're really trying to bring them closer to what are your business goals generally, and then where does DEI overlay? Okay, so you're trying to, grow market share by 10% by 2026. How does DEI overlay into that? So it's not, again, it's not over here off to the side. It's not being given little air to breathe. It's really integrated into how you're looking at reaching your overall business goals.
The very first episode of your podcast was called DEI is Dead, which
Mm,
is a great title, super provocative and super relevant because,
yep.
as anyone who works in the DEI space will tell you, we've lost that momentum that we had starting in 2020 with George Floyd and the racial justice movement. And now we're seeing, at the very best, a lack of attention, but at worst, fatigue, cutbacks, backsliding, and even backlash. Can you
Mm.
talk about the current landscape of corporate DEI and what we need to do to push past this place that we're in now?
So I think one of the most challenging pieces around DEI is there's not a uniform standard of what good looks like. And I say that because we have in many other industries and areas a standard. I always use the example, I'm an employment lawyer, and I think about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That is a statute that's really commonly used by employment lawyers because it's typically where discrimination claims come from. And the standard for proving discrimination has been well established for many decades. So, your mind automatically goes, if you get a claim in, or when I'm investigating a claim and someone's making a claim of discrimination, my mind instantly starts to go to the elements of the claim. We don't have that in DEI. We have a lot of attempts at it. But again, like I said, it's about a 20, 25-year-old industry. So in some ways, it's still pretty new in the way that it's being talked about now. And so that makes it really hard for companies because they're not so sure what they're aiming for all the time. And that's understandable, right? Like you want to know what we're doing this because we're trying to get to where. And because there aren't certain standards that tell you when you get to this point in your practices, you're going to experience this type of growth. It can be very nebulous for companies. So I think, to give some companies the benefit of the doubt, I think that is definitely a challenge. So for us, we look at it again on where you are in your journey, not that you're supposed to be somewhere else, but that where are you today and where can we get you to? And how can we get past like these surface level metrics? Like we want to have 10% women in leadership by X year. Okay, but why? Not because you shouldn't have more representation, but usually leaders start to get really like, well, why is this the number? Like, what are we doing this for? And no one can really ever answer it. So we really try to get deeper than that and like, what kind of impact are you trying to have? And so we have really great success still with our phone ringing and people still needing the help. And I will say that the vast majority of the C-suite individuals that we deal with recognize the importance of DEI. And so we haven't seen a slowdown in people saying, hey, we don't care about that. That's not important, because they're smart enough to know like their employees are demanding it. It's the way of the world. It's the way that you're going to, grow your business. There's so many great studies out there that show this. But it's then what? Like, how do you get yourself past the recognition that it's important and into something substantive? And because the demands on this industry have really changed drastically since George Floyd, it's very difficult at times for companies to find folks that can actually get in there and help them be strategic. I think a lot of companies feel like they can dump this work on marginalized folks because of their lived experience, but we regularly hear from marginalized people who are on DEI committees, like, we're not experts. Like, they get themselves to a certain point and then they don't know where to go from that. So that's why we're always promoting the need for expertise and the need for strategic expertise, like understanding what a strategy is. And I'm not saying that to be funny. A lot of people don't seem to understand what a strategy is when it comes to DEI. We have this conversation a lot. And so it's like bringing them to that point of, okay, let's push past the surface of these conversations we've been having. The other piece is that people really struggle with the time factor. These issues didn't happen overnight. They don't get fixed overnight. So that flurry of activity that we saw in 2020 was sort of like people running a sprint instead of the marathon. If you think about the fact that just like in 1964, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when my dad was a teenager, it was still legal to discriminate in employment on the basis of race, gender, religion, the like. That was not very long ago. So we're still in the space of like these things take time to fix, which no one wants to hear, including me. Like, I'm impatient about it too. But a lot of our work starts from building trust, and there's not a lot of trust right now between employees and employers, and frankly even between leaders. And so getting to the point of getting people to even have a basic level of trust to move these conversations forward, that in itself takes time.
We've spent some time talking about DEI in corporate spaces, but there is so much going on in the news about DEI and our governments. You're based in Miami.
Yep.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has made headlines for opposing critical race theory, for the Don't Say Gay law.
Hmm.
His website calls DEI divisive, and he hosted a roundtable earlier this year exposing what he calls the DEI scam in higher education.
Hmm.
What on earth is going on in your state?
Oh, wow. Well, a lot. And I think about what these headlines that you're referring to, the thing that comes to mind always is this concept of resisting reality. And so I think our governor is resisting reality in a huge way. And there's multiple realities that I think he's resisting. First and foremost, if you're just thinking about this position when it comes to business, I mean, it's bizarre because businesses are still focused on DEI. And so it's sort of like, do you want businesses to want to come here or not? I mean, that's the money version of it, right? Like, that's the part that really is mind-boggling for me when I think about, states are typically trying to attract business and money into their states. I have not for the life of me been able to figure out that logic. But more importantly, it resists, number one, diversity is already here, right? Our country is very diverse. Purportedly, we were founded on being a melting pot for different cultures and such. We're here, so that you can't get past. The second reality that it resists is that the information exists freely in the world. So you're trying to prevent higher education from having degrees or courses that focus on equity and racial equity and the like. If someone is interested and they've decided that that is the route they want to go, it's out here in the world, right? It's not, we're not in the age where information is so controlled that if you say we're not going to hear it, we're not going to do it, we're not going to see it, that it's not going to happen. And so again, in that part, it drives potential students away from attending Florida universities. And so all in all, like it's bizarre because it's sort of like the reality, it doesn't match reality. And you see resisting reality a lot. I was actually watching a, a conversation with potential school board candidates in a county in Pennsylvania. And one of the candidates was very anti DEI, and the moderator was really incredible at like navigating that and really asking the tough questions. Is, look, what does DEI mean to you? And she had a blank face. And what is it that you're concerned about? And the woman finally answered in the way that I keep describing to people. She's like, I'm very fearful that if we are focusing on DEI, that people who aren't that way are going to feel bad about themselves. And when she was pushed, it was that people who aren't people of color, which I would guess would mean she meant white people, are going to feel bad if we're talking about, the history of this country. And I think it's fascinating because when people start to resist reality, it always seems to be fear based, that they feel their identity is going to be challenged in some way by sharing space with others so that they can see their identities represented in what they're learning about. And, we talk about this a lot in terms of if you think about it as power, right? They feel powerful that their identity is sort of the dominant identity and they can control that narrative. But if you really think about power, it's infinite. So, making space for other people's views to be heard and seen and their history to be represented only adds to us. It doesn't take away from people. And I think it's going to be an interesting sort of journey forward on how do you break into that fear. Because, again, like I said, it resists reality. I mean, if you look at TikTok, there's DEI trends all day, every day. Pretty much anytime you open a headline here in the US, it's something that relates to DEI in some way, either the D, the E, or the I. So it's like we're here, it's happening. So it's just, again, like I said, to me, it's just a very bizarre thing that's difficult to figure out from a business standpoint, from a reality, like just a regular reality standpoint, and of course, the humanity of it all.
It's definitely bizarre, but it's also really worrisome because these are people who are in a position of power.
Hmm.
DeSantis is going to run for president. Florida is not the only state that is experiencing something like this. And as you mentioned earlier, DEI is not one person's work.
Right.
So, as someone who does this work all the time for the last 2 decades, what can we be doing? Those of us who are part of marginalized communities, those of us who are allies, all of us who care about having a more inclusive and equitable America to prevent DEI from being defunded or to prevent DEI legislation from being undone.
So, the first and foremost, going back to something I said earlier, what is your why in this space? Why are you involved in it? It's really important to know your why because it's very easy to get like off track. And by that I mean there are so many worthy causes to focus on and it can become very overwhelming, especially again if this is not that your area of expertise but you have a love for it. And that's where the fatigue can come in because you have CEOs like I don't want to say the wrong thing, like I don't know what I'm supposed to say, and it's like we really focus on it's not about good, bad, right, wrong. Like we're going to make mistakes, but it's the vulnerability and being willing to own it. So it's really spending that time with yourself on why is this work important to you, whether it's because you're marginalized or you want to be an ally or a combination, all of that. So that's the first piece. And recognizing that self exploration and your why is ongoing, right? It's something you've got to keep doing. I also think, and it's going to sound really basic, but something happened during the pandemic that really changed how we interact with each other. Um, and I think a lot of it, and I'm not a psychologist, and I'm really fascinated to see how psychologists are going to study this, but I think it really changed sort of like interpersonal interactions where when I'm doing investigations, I mean, I'm so shocked at some of the complaints I'm seeing now because it's like these little things are causing these big disputes and it's like people are just not talking to each other. And like I mentioned earlier, to do this work and for it to be effective, there has to be trust. So it's really important for people to step outside their comfort zones, cross party lines, cross ideological lines to try to understand where people are going from. I've actually done that a lot recently where, talking to folks who are Republicans and conservative and like not here to judge you. I really want to understand where you're coming from because if I don't understand where you're coming from, we're never going to be having the same conversation. So again, I think the first two things are very sort of personal things of knowing your why, understanding where people are coming from, and then really be front facing about using your voice, right? If you're inside a company, really using your voice regularly and getting folks with you to push the issues that are important because eventually obviously businesses understand that this is important, but eventually businesses also have to push these politicians through their lobbying efforts and the like, um, if there's going to be a big movement here for change. So I think it's again at the end of it all, we have to be pushing folks who are in positions of power, who can make a difference constantly and regularly. Recognizing one protest isn't enough, one letter is not enough, one social media post is not enough. Like, that part is really huge, is the consistency of it all. Because I will tell you, I mean, you see this from the research. It's going to be harder and harder for companies to attract Gen Z and millennial employees if they're not super focused on this. There's so much research about this is how those generations are making decisions, which I applaud. I mean, I'm in Gen X, and I don't think I would have had that courage, when I was looking for a job. So I love to see it, but that's sort of like, in the end, diversity is not going away. So to get to the equitable piece, to get to the inclusive piece, requires a great deal of intentionality consistently.
This has been so informative. Thank you so much, Natalie, for sharing the unique ways you're helping people make the most of the time we've been given by transforming workplaces so that we can all feel welcomed and empowered to be our authentic selves. And thank you all for watching On the Clock. We'll see you next time as we continue to talk about working with purpose and living with passion.